Here are the ways the US can contain China's trade. The US and China are currently engaged in a simmering trade dispute that is attracting a great deal of attention on the global scene. The two countries have the largest economies in the world, and as such, any trade war between them will have a significant global impact. The trade dispute gained major traction in 2018 when the then US President Donald Trump imposed tariffs and barriers on China. The main aim of imposing tariffs was to coerce China to effect changes to its unfair trade practices and stop infringements on US intellectual property rights. The US has all along argued that unfair trade practices and intellectual property infringements were contributing to the trade deficit between the two countries. China on its part has argued that the US was resorting to nationalistic protectionism to counter its international rise in the world economy. It is a fact that the admission of China into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001 led to an exponential increase in the volume of trade with the US. Trade data for 2019 showed that the bilateral trade between the US and China totaled about $559 billion. However, the balance of trade appears to favor China, with the US importing more goods. By 2017, the deficit from bilateral trade in goods reached $375.6 billion, which is a significant rise when compared to $103.1 billion in 2002. President Donald Trump began by placing new tariffs on $200 billion worth of goods from China. By 2020, the US tariffs on Chinese goods reached $360 billion United States dollars. China countered these measures by instituting similar tariffs on US goods. The impact of the trade war has been significant to both countries. The US has suffered an increase in the cost of manufacturing, high consumer prices, and huge losses by farmers. Likewise, the dispute has drastically cut the economic and industrial growth rate in China, with the investment held by China in the US dropping by about 90% during the period of the dispute. Moreover, the trade dispute had a big impact on the global economy. By December 2019, the two countries reached what they termed as Phase 1 trade deal, which was essentially an agreement based on principles. What can the US do to contain China's predatory trade tendencies? The US needs to take several steps to contain China's trade behemoth. To begin with, the US needs to coerce China to purchase the volume of goods that they agreed during the trade talks. During the US-China trade talks, China had committed to purchase $200 billion worth of US products, including agricultural goods, industrial, and energy products. In addition, China had committed to liberalize the market and allow the US financial service providers access to its market. Therefore, the US must ensure that China abide by these commitments. The US also needs to follow up on the proposal by the Treasury Department for audit inspection of Chinese firms. In August 2020, the Treasury Department resolved to delist from the U.S. Securities Exchange's Chinese companies that refuse to allow auditing by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board of the U.S. Naturally, the Chinese companies are hesitant to accept auditing by the U.S. because of their ownership structure. It is noteworthy to point out that most of the Chinese enterprises are either wholly or partly owned by the state. For this reason, the U.S. needs to apply sections of an act that was passed by the Senate which required foreign companies to be accountable to U.S. authorities. The act prohibits companies from trading in the U.S. securities exchanges if they have not been audited by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board for over 3 straight years or have failed to demonstrate that they are free of foreign government control or ownership. China is likely to accept the auditing procedures and standards because it cannot afford to be delisted from the most liquid and biggest financial market in the world. On the issue of intellectual property rights, the U.S. will require to strengthen its enforcement mechanism to monitor infringements of patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets by China. The pact signed during the US and China trade talks obliged the Chinese government to cease the mandatory measures which required foreign investors to transfer technology to local joint ventures. Therefore, there is a need for the US to pressure China to allow US companies to trade without being forced to transfer their technologies to Chinese enterprises. The Chinese government should put in place a framework for the transfer of US technology to China instead of stealing intellectual property from US inventors. Furthermore, the US needs to pursue the Chinese enterprises which are suspected of stealing the intellectual property assets of US inventors. The US should make it difficult for those particular Chinese companies to conduct business not only in the US but also on the global stage. Recently, the US has started pursuing some big technology companies from China that are suspected of infringing on the intellectual property regimes of US companies. The companies being pursued include ByteDance, which owns the short video sharing app TikTok, and the smartphone maker, Huawei. The US also needs to review or even drastically reduce the supply chain linkages with China. The supply chains are complex interconnections of companies that coordinate together to produce products and goods by linking the regional or global supply of raw materials, intermediate parts, and expertise. Currently, both countries have become highly interdependent through supply chain linkages established over many years of conducting trade. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, estimated that in 2015, the foreign input of total goods and services consumed in the US stood at 12.2% or $2.2 trillion. The data showed that China was by far the largest contributor to foreign input. Therefore, the US must find ways of reducing the over-reliance on Chinese inputs in its consumption economy. The US must strive to force the Chinese government to play by the rules set by the World Trade Organization, WTO. The US has alleged that China continues to undermine WTO trade guidelines and is not committed to fair trade practices. The US needs to urge WTO member states to develop a new set of trade rules which will address some of the economic practices of China that are not covered by the current WTO commitments. Some of the aspects that are not addressed by the WTO commitments include the issue of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, subsidies, and trade in digital space. The US must ensure that China gives a full account of the state-owned enterprises and the subsidies they accrue as required by the WTO. The US should work with the WTO member countries to introduce safeguards that are specific to China. Moreover, the US should endeavor to reform the dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO to ensure that it is fairly quick and effective. So far, the US has made some progress on the issue of the transfer of technology, especially with the passing of FIRRMA, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and ECRA, Export Control Reform Act, in 2018. With these pieces of legislation, companies can decide which technologies to transfer to foreign countries. However, the US should encourage other countries to adopt similar regimes for restricting the export of technology. This will ensure that other countries do not take advantage of the US restrictions by exporting similar technologies to China and hence undercut the US. Some of the indirect benefits which companies from China enjoy are underpriced land from the state and privileged relationship with banks, state and local authorities. The WTO should be in a position to develop rules and regulations which spell out the issues that comprise non-commercial assistance to state-owned companies. The US has singled out the unfair trade practices, theft of intellectual property assets, and the forced transfer of technology as being the biggest threats to manufacturing and job creation in the US. Indeed, the US services and knowledge economy has suffered a lot from China's unfair trade practices. There is a feeling that the reason China steals the intellectual property of US inventors is to overtake the US as the premier leader in high-tech industries. It is also a fact that China enjoys an undue advantage over its competitors because of the use of state-owned enterprises which have access to subsidies. Furthermore, unlike US companies, the state-owned enterprises can maneuver and underpass regulations which give them an undue advantage over competitors.
To keep watching more cool facts, please subscribe to our channel now.